This episode of Still Unanswered is about a case that sits uncomfortably between two very different kinds of stories. The story of brutal crimes against women, many of whom were marginalized and underprotected, and the story of a narrative that some say turned those crimes into something larger, into a kind of satanic cult with rituals and a lurid mythology. I'm Mara Ellison. Tonight, with me, Dr. Lionel Reyes, criminologist and legal scholar. Lionel, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mara. It's important work you do. These cases demand careful unpacking.
We're going to walk through the Chicago Ripper Crew case, not simply to repackage the horror, but to sit with the uncertainty. We'll talk about who the men were, who the victims were, what the evidence actually shows, and where the story might have been shaped by interrogation practices, prosecutorial choices, and the cultural appetite for a satanic explanation. There will be disturbing material ahead. We'll keep it measured and centered on the people at the heart of this. Are you ready?
I am, and I want listeners to know up front. The goal is not to exonerate violence or dodge accountability. It's to interrogate the record that underpins convictions and public narratives, because the stakes are huge when lives, liberty, and history hinge on what we accept as true.
Right. Let's start with an image that should be in every retelling, but often isn't. The hospital room where a survivor named Beverly Washington woke up after an assault on October 6, 1982. She's found near railroad tracks, stabbed and mutilated, but alive. She describes a red van and some features of her attacker. That tiny, fragile witness account, given by a woman who had every reason to fear or distrust the police, was what broke the case open. Beverly gives detectives the thread they need: a van, a description, a lead into a social circle. Lionel, can you remind listeners why a survivor's account like that matters so much in cases like this?
A survivor's account is crucial in many ways. First, it can identify a vehicle, a voice, a smell, sensory details that can be corroborated. Second, it can provide the narrative anchor that lets investigators tie disparate crime scenes together. But there's a tension. Survivors are often interviewed under trauma, sometimes without optimal supports, and their memory can be shaped by leading questions. That doesn't mean Beverly's account was invalid. It just means we should treat it as one piece of evidence and examine how other evidence supported or failed to support what she reported.
Which brings us to the men the investigation turned toward: Robin Gecht, Edward Spreitzer, Andrew Kokoraleis, and Thomas Kokoraleis. They become known in media as the Ripper Crew. Robin called in some headlines Robin the Ripper. But here's the question we'll keep returning to. Were these four men part of a ritualistic satanic cult, or were they violent criminals whose acts were later framed in occult terms? Lionel, give us a quick sketch of each man so listeners have faces to the names.
Briefly, Robin Gecht was the older figure in the group. A carpenter, a husband and father on the surface, but described by others as controlling and obsessed with occult imagery. Edward Spreitzer was younger, worked for Gecht, lived for a time with the Gecht family, someone described as impressionable and loyal. Andrew and Thomas Kokoraleis were brothers, young men who also worked odd jobs, often with Gecht. Where it gets legally and morally complicated is that all three younger men gave confessions that described grisly rituals and implicated Gecht as a leader. Gecht himself was convicted for rape and mutilation in a case tied to Beverly, but he was never convicted for murder.
And Andrew Kokoraleis was executed in 1999. the last person Illinois executed before the state's moratorium and eventual abolition of the death penalty. That fact alone adds a heavy aftertaste to this story. We'll get to Andrew's confession, recantation, appeals, and execution later. For now, let's go back to the crime pattern the police were seeing in 1981-82. The common elements: abduction, sexual assault, torture, and a recurring mutilation, the removal or mutilation of one or both breasts. Bodies dumped in fields, cemeteries, roadsides. Women targeted included sex workers and other women alone at vulnerable moments. Lionel, from a criminological perspective, how do investigators interpret a pattern like that?
Patterns tell you about motive, modus operandi, and possibly linkage, whether crimes are the work of the same actor or group. The breast mutilation is a specific signature that can suggest sexual sadism, symbolic intent, or a killer's personal ritual. But signatures aren't a perfect roadmap. They can be mimicked, misattributed, or highlighted selectively in media. Investigators use them to group cases. Courts need more: physical evidence, credible witness testimony, corroboration. In this case, the pattern was strong enough to alarm both police and the public. But whether it pointed to a coherent, belief-driven cult is debatable.
Let me read a short scene, imagined only to give scale to the moment. A red 1975 Dodge van rolling through neighborhoods where sex workers sometimes worked the streets. A woman gets in, thinking it's another client. The van's interior is strange. Then later, a small, candlelit attic room in a North Side house, walls scrawled with symbols, a chair set up like a throne. Prosecutors and later tellers described ceremonies in that attic. But we have to ask, what did police actually find? Lionel?
Police did search Gecht's home and reported an attic area with candles, crude occult symbols, and a chair. That's verifiable. They also reportedly found a metal box containing women's belongings, IDs, jewelry, items that could be trophies. Those are physical findings. What's harder to corroborate are some of the more lurid details: preserved human tissue, definitive physical proof of ritual cannibalism, or documentation that every claimed ritual took place exactly as described by later interviews. The attic matters because it supports the narrative of a leader and a ritual space, but it doesn't, by itself, prove supernatural belief or make every confession true in every detail.
Right. And the confessions are the largest, most problematic artifact in this case. Spritzer, Andrew, and Thomas all gave detailed confessions, overlapping stories about abductions, torture, breast removal, and rituals led by Gecht. But the 1980s interrogation environment in Chicago often featured long, sometimes coercive questioning, and many defendants later recanted, claiming coercion, promises, even physical abuse. Lionel, what are the markers that a confession is reliable versus coerced?
There are a few hallmarks. Reliable confessions often contain details that are independently corroborated, facts about the crime scene that were not public knowledge, details that only someone present would know. Coerced confessions, by contrast, sometimes contain inconsistencies, are very narrative-heavy with grandiose details, or mirror investigative suggestions. The interview environment also matters. Were sessions recorded? Were counsel and support present? In the early 80s, in many jurisdictions, full electronic recording was not standard, so we're often left with the word of interrogators against the word of suspects. Add youth, mental vulnerability, or promises of leniency, and the risk of false confession increases.
Andrew Coker-Relace later recanted and said he had been beaten and promised leniency. that his detailed confessions were the result of pressure. Yet, some of his accounts matched others. That overlap made prosecutors argue for reliability. How do we square overlapping confessions with recantations?
Overlaps can mean several things. They might indicate coordinated, truth-shared participation, or they might reflect contamination. Once one defendant describes a narrative, media coverage or interrogators can feed those details to others. Young people, eager to please, fearful of pain or punishment, may echo the version presented to them. So, overlapping confessions are suggestive but not dispositive. Courts often weigh corroboration. If the confessions put a suspect in a location with detail only the perpetrator would know, it carries more weight. But in cases where public information or police suggestions can explain overlaps, the reliability is more suspect.
Let's pause. One more human anchor before we move deeper. Lorraine Lori Borofsky. She was a 21-year-old receptionist abducted on May 15, 1982, while opening a real estate office. Her bag, her things, were found dropped outside. She vanished within minutes. Her body was later found in a Clarendon Hills cemetery. Thomas Kokorales was convicted in her murder and served 70 years, though he was released in 2019 after credit for time served and other factors. Her family, like the families of others, got a conviction. But still, questions remain. Lionel, how does society weigh a conviction like Thomas's against the sense that the full story, especially about a possible leader, was never fully pinned down?
Legal systems operate case by case. Prosecutors pursued the cases they believed were winnable with available evidence. For Borofsky murder, they secured a conviction that satisfied criminal law's burden in that instance. But from a societal point of view, that can feel incomplete if there is a strong, plausible suspicion that other actors or a ringleader escaped full murder accountability. The result is tension. Victims' families can get a measure of closure from a conviction, even as broader explanatory threads remain unresolved. That's why this story is so morally complicated.
We're about 20 minutes in, and I want to slow down and center the victims and survivors again. So many of the women are described only in the shorthand of the era. Sex worker, a number, a case file. Linda Sutton, 28, was one of the earliest recognized victims. Abducted May 1981, found in a field with her breast amputated. Rose Beck Davis, Sandra Delaware, Shui Mock. These were women with families, with stories that the press compressed. We should name them and try to imagine more than the wound they suffered. Lionel, how do investigators and social systems tend to undervalue victims who are sex workers or otherwise marginalized? And what does that do for the course of an investigation?
Historically, victims who are sex workers, homeless, or otherwise marginalized often receive less rigorous attention from institutions, fewer resources devoted to cases, less public empathy, and sometimes biased investigative assumptions. That can mean patterns are missed, leads are ignored, and crimes are not linked as quickly. On the flip side, when a pattern is finally recognized, it sometimes leads to moral panic, where the public and media demand immediate answers, which pressures investigators to produce narratives. That dynamic can generate hasty conclusions or an over-reliance on high-emotion evidence like confessions that seem to make sense of the horror.
That moral panic piece leads us to the idea of satanic panic that exploded in the 1980s. The Ripper crew predates the peak of that panic, but fits into its rising arc. Prosecutors painted an image of rituals, blood offerings, and a cult led by Robin Gecht. True crime peddlers reinforced those images for decades. But as researchers have shown, many satanic panic narratives later unraveled. Lionel, where should we place the Chicago Ripper crew on that spectrum? Legitimate occult belief versus a cultural overlay?
Place it cautiously in between. There's credible evidence, Gecht's attic, some statements by co-defendants, and items suggestive of trophies that a ritualistic or symbolic element existed. Gecht appears to have cultivated an image and exercised strong influence over younger men. But many of the more sensational claims, systematic cannibalism, elaborate supernatural theology, formal cult hierarchy, are harder to definitively prove. So while the group may have used occult symbols and staged ritualistic acts, the extent to which they were true believers in a coherent satanic religion is ambiguous. Cultural appetites for a satanic explanation likely amplified and fixed certain dramatic details into public understanding.
Let me flip this back to you, Lionel. Given the evidence we have, attic artifacts, overlapping confessions, a survivor's identification, what reasonable alternative narratives exist besides the full cult story?
We can imagine several plausible alternatives. 1. The men were violent sexual predators who adopted occult symbolism opportunistically, using ritual language and acts to reinforce power dynamics and terror, not because they believed in a cosmic satanic order. 2. The narrative is partly true. There were ritualized elements in a sexual sadist subculture controlled by Gecht, but the cult framing was exaggerated by confessions and media. 3. Some of the confessions were contaminated or coerced, and the true picture is more fractured. Not every murder described in confessions happened exactly as told, and some crimes attributed to the crew were the work of other perpetrators. Each alternative has different implications for justice and for how we write this history.
And that last point, other perpetrators, is crucial. There were murders in Chicago and suburbs during that time with similar mutilations that were never tied conclusively to the Ripper crew. So our certainty about the body count is shakier than headlines suggest. Prosecutors suspected up to 17 victims. Media placed the number sometimes higher. But legally, convictions cover only a subset. Lionel, what should listeners take away from this uncertainty about numbers?
Numbers matter because they shape public memory and policy. If we undercount, we erase victims. If we overcount without evidence, we risk collapsing separate crimes and enabling false closure. The takeaway is this: err on the side of specificity. Say convicted in X murders when that's true, and say suspected in up to Y when that's what investigators believed. And always ask whose deaths are easier to link to powerful narratives and whose are neglected. That's both an evidentiary challenge and an ethical one.
We need to spend time on interrogations and courtroom strategies. Prosecutors had an incentive to lock down cases where they could, and that often meant relying on the confessions of vulnerable young men. In Andrew's case, he eventually recanted and made claims that he was beaten and promised leniency. He was nonetheless convicted and executed. Lionel, how did the political and legal context of Illinois in the 1980s and 90s shape the outcomes we saw?
The 1980s were a tough-on-crime era. Public pressure for convictions in high-profile crimes was intense. Illinois retained the death penalty, and prosecutors sometimes sought capital charges in cases that captured public attention, both to punish and to signal responsiveness. Appeals and due process did occur, but the threshold for reversing convictions based on confession coercion was frankly higher than we might want. By the time of Andrew's execution in 1999, the state and nation were already questioning capital punishment, which is why his being the last person executed in Illinois is symbolically heavy. He carried the state's death penalty history to its endpoint.
Spreitzer's death sentence was commuted to life in 2003 by Governor George Ryan, along with many others, reflecting growing doubts about death penalty fairness in Illinois. Thomas was released in 2019 after serving decades, and then became the focus of community protests wherever he tried to settle. Gecht remains imprisoned 120 years for the rape and mutilation conviction tied to Beverly, but he was never convicted of murder. That distribution of outcomes, one executed, one free, one longtime prisoner, one unconvicted for murder, feels to many irregular. Is that irregularity evidence of failure or evidence of a justice system working as intended, convicting where it can?
Both, in a way. It's evidence of a system that operates case by case, constrained by evidence. If prosecutors had a slam-dunk murder case against Gecht, they would have pursued it. The fact they did not suggests either insufficient corroboration or strategic choice. But it's also evidence of a system that can produce harsh finality in one case, execution, while failing to fully address the responsibility of others. That is a kind of failure. The system gives us disparate fates that may not track moral culpability proportionally.
Let's talk about the human aftermath. Victims' families report relief when convictions happened, but also persistent grief and frustration, especially when the total victim count remained unresolved, and when someone like Thomas could be released. There were protests in Aurora when Thomas went to transitional housing. Communities were scared, and some felt betrayed. Lionel, how do communities process the return of someone associated with such notorious crimes?
It's fraught. Communities balance public safety, legal rights, and their own trauma. Even if someone has served a sentence, their presence can feel like a reopening of wounds, especially for victims' families. There's also the need to respect legal processes. If someone fulfilled their sentence and met release criteria, they have points of rights. That tension between rule of law fairness and communal sense of justice often lacks an easy resolution. Transparent communication, victim-centered support, and monitored reintegration can help, but they don't erase pain.
I want to take a beat and include a listening moment of silence for the victims, those named and those unnamed. Thank you. Now, for listeners who are thinking about how stories like this get told and retold, the true crime economy tends to package neat narratives, headlines and serials that emphasize satanic rituals, trophies, and leaders. That sells. But what does that do to our understanding of systemic failures? Lionel?
It simplifies and sensationalizes. When we focus on the monstrous leader or on shocking ritual details, we risk obscuring the ways ordinary systems, police bias, prosecutorial strategy, economic marginalization, create environments where violence thrives and goes under-scrutinized. Simplified narratives are emotionally satisfying, but they can distort responsibility and policy response. If we want prevention, we need to look at structural issues: how victims are marginalized, how investigations are resourced, how confessions are obtained and vetted.
So, the case is a mirror. It shows us individual violence and a hunger for tidy stories, and it illuminates larger problems, interrogation practices that risk false confession, a media ecosystem that amplifies the spectacular, a justice system that distributes life and death unequally. Before we move to our wrap and the list of questions that are still unanswered, I want to take a moment to play devil's advocate for some listeners who maybe say, but the confessions were detailed, victims' belongings found, attic with candles. Isn't it obvious? These men were monsters and a cult. Lionel, how would you respond to that straightforward reading?
I would say not to minimize the very real harm and the physical evidence you mention, but there's a difference between evidence that supports a broad conclusion that these men were dangerous and that horrific crimes occurred, and evidence that supports every specific interpretive claim made in the press. The attic and trophies are powerful. The confessions are powerful. But the legal system must knit them together into an evidentiary tapestry that proves particular crimes occurred in particular ways. We should be willing to conclude that harm happened and that people were culpable, while still acknowledging uncertainty about specifics, like the exact number of victims attributed to the crew or the sincerity of every ritual claim.
That measured ambiguity is difficult for many listeners, especially survivors and families who crave certainty. But it's essential if we're trying to understand how justice was served or not. Okay, we're rounding into our final segment, still unanswered. I'll read a list, and Lionel can add context and why each point matters. First, the true victim count. Official convictions cover at most 6 murders linked in court to members of the crew. Police suspected up to 17, maybe more. Which of those missing numbers matters beyond curiosity?
All of them matter because each number represents an individual who died. Beyond that, an accurate count determines resource allocation to cold cases, informs family closure, and shapes prevention policy. If we miss victims because they were marginalized sex workers, for instance, we fail in public health and public safety.
Second, the nature of the cult. Were they true believers who practiced a coherent satanic doctrine? Or were ritual elements a mask, a method of control, or later embellishment? Lionel?
We need richer primary documentation, interrogation records, credible independent corroboration, to say. Evidence does show ritual-like behavior, but belief and structure are distinct from performative terror. Clarifying that matters because it influences how we interpret motive and prevent similar groups.
Third, the reliability of the confessions. How many details were corroborated independently? How many could be products of coercion or contamination? Listeners, this matters for how we understand guilt and innocence. Lionel, why does the science on false confessions from the era matter here?
Because the era had well-documented vulnerabilities, lengthy unrecorded interrogations, fewer procedural protections for suspects, and a political climate that prized confessions. Modern research shows that vulnerable suspects, young, suggestible, fearful, are at higher risk of false confession. So when a major part of a prosecutor's case rests on that kind of confession, we owe it to justice to scrutinize the conditions under which it was produced.
Fourth, why did Gecht escape murder convictions? He's described by co-defendants as a leader. He had an attic, and he was convicted for the assault on Beverly, 120 years. But for murders, prosecutors either couldn't or didn't secure convictions. Is this evidence of prosecutorial strategy or of insufficient evidence? Lionel.
It's likely both. Prosecutors sometimes forego weaker murder counts to consolidate stronger cases elsewhere, especially if convictions there guarantee long sentences. They may have also lacked the kind of forensic or eyewitness corroboration that courts increasingly demand. Strategically, locking down life sentences for key perpetrators can be a pragmatic, though imperfect, approach.
Fifth, and perhaps the hardest, did we as a society value these victims less because of who they were? And did that shape which cases were linked, which were fully investigated, and how the narrative formed? Lionel.
Historically, yes. Marginalized victims often receive less attention. That bias doesn't absolve perpetrators. It indicts us. It means some victims are left out of the story, and sometimes whole crimes are never fully connected because the victims' lives were devalued. Asking that question is critical for policy reform and for how we tell these stories ethically.
Before we close, I want to let you push back, Lionel. Is there a question I haven't asked that you wish we had? Or a correction to common myths that listeners should carry forward?
I'd like listeners to resist two impulses. The impulse to demonize everything as either purely occult or purely criminally opportunistic, and the impulse to accept confessions at face value without context. Also, this is important, don't confuse media repetition with judicial fact. Some lurid claims circulate widely because they're compelling, not because they're fully corroborated. Hold both the horror of what happened and the need for rigorous evidence simultaneously.
That's a tough but necessary balance. We'll leave it there. I want to thank you, Lionel. This was a hard conversation, but a valuable one. Before we sign off, a few final notes for listeners. For further reading, we'll include a short bibliography, careful, critical sources, trial records where available, and survivor-centered reporting. If you're hearing this and you're affected by the episode, seek support. Hotlines and local counseling resources can help. And finally, this podcast aims to ask better questions than it answers.
Thank you, Mara. And to anyone impacted by this discussion, by violence, by grief, you're not alone. Systems can change, but only if we keep asking the uncomfortable questions.
Still Unanswered is produced with the helpers and survivors who let us tell this story. We try to center victims and skepticism in equal measure. I'm Mara Ellison. Dr. Lionel Reyes, thank you. One last thing. The names of victims we discussed, Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borofsky, Rose Beck Davis, Sandra Delaware, Shui Mock, Beverly Washington, are not just case files. They were people with lives before these crimes. Take a moment to hold that with me. If you want to go deeper, look for the sources we based the episode on. We've aimed to be transparent. This is Still Answered. We'll be back next week with another case we need to keep interrogating. Good night.